So, today we're going to be picking up this topic of biological determinism, which we've talked about a bit before. A lot of the times that I've talked about how science leads us at times to believe that biology creates social traits, right? So we're going to talk a bit more in detail about what that approach to gender, that approach to sex, that approach to social identity looks like, and specifically the cultural manifestations of it, right? In other words, this will, in a roundabout way, kind of argue that science is cultural, right? That science enters into culture, enters into mainstream culture in all sorts of different ways. So, for example, I talked like a couple weeks ago about 23andMe, that like DNA testing service that you can do, like you send in, I don't know if anybody's done it, perhaps hair, maybe, I'm not sure.
You like swab the inside of your mouth.
Swab the inside of your mouth, right, and send it in. And through a number of different scientific methods, it gives you sort of a readout of a number of different things, can connect you with long-lost family members, let you know that you're, related to Michelle Obama through some sort of distant relatives, right? Or perhaps tell you what would be described as a racial or ethnic makeup of your ancestry based off of different, genetic signifiers that they read. So certainly science and culture, science and pop culture, are not entirely distinct from one another. Working two computers here, all right? So, central to this course is the notion, as we've talked about, that identities are socially constructed. Different meanings are strung together and it's attached to different bodies. These meanings vary over time and location and are subject to change, or what we might call reconstruction, right? So if identities are socially constructed, but they change over time, then that means they're always socially reconstructed in different and new ways, right? In fact, we could say that gender never is something, right? Gender is always in a state of becoming something, right? So anytime that we are trying to pause and take a snapshot of what femininity in the United States looks like, at the point that we even push the button on that camera, femininity is already in a process of changing into something different, right? That process is slow, but it's constant. So rather than seeing our identities as biological, we should understand them as social, right? They're socially determined, they emerge and develop and change through social relations. However, as we've mentioned, and as I really want to stress, right, biological traits are still important, right? This isn't, when we say that identities are socially constructed, it doesn't mean that we don't have bodies, right? And that our bodies aren't important, and that our bodies aren't the sites upon which those identities become written and rewritten through our skin, our hair, our movement, right? What we do, how we hold ourselves, our various traits, right? Biology is important, but it doesn't in the final moment determine what we do, right? So in other words, it doesn't in the final moment determine how our masculinity or our femininity appears. Now, social constructionist approaches to identity, and we're going to be talking a lot today about gender and about sex, contrast with what's called this biological determinist approach, right? And this term biological determinist or biological determinism, right, in a lot of ways it's a self-evident term. Biology determines, right? Biology determines. It refers to when you assign biology determinative power over social identities like race, sex, gender, sexuality, or others, right? Determinative power. That biology determines our gender identity, right? Now, you can certainly have varying degrees of biological determinism, right? You can be someone who believes that biology just determines everything, right? Everything that we're doing, everything that we're saying, all of our traits about ourselves are simply biological processes, right? Now, you can be somebody else who believes that biology pretty much determines most everything, but sometimes, right, things can be thrown asunder, right? Perhaps because of social interaction, right? Now, so for example, somebody who believes that everybody is naturally straight because that's biologically determined because of our evolutionary history and need to reproduce, right? Might also at the same time uphold the belief that, like, gay parents raising children will somehow raise gay children, right? Now, those two beliefs would seemingly be in contrast. The belief that heterosexuality is natural and biologically determined, but at the same time that social relations could make somebody not straight, right? seemingly in contrast. And again, not everybody holds strictly to either this or this approach, right? Some people kind of vary between them. In fact, most people, I would say, hold on to aspects of both of these approaches, right? In fact, one of the easy ways to think about it is the notion of being born this way, right? Or debates that we saw about nature and nurture, largely in the late 90s and early 2000s, pertaining to same-sex marriage and pertaining to sexuality in general and sexual identity, right? This question of whether or not, right, as was hotly debated at the time, homosexuality, right, being gay, being lesbian, whether or not that was something that was nature, right, something built into our biology in some sort of way, or nurture, right, something that was socially kind of influenced, right, that emerged through how we were raised, how we were nurtured, right, our social setting. Now, if you ask anybody, who's an established and respected person in psychology, in biology, in gender and women's studies, in any major academic field, they'll say that we know that this notion of a nature-nurture debate is an entirely false dichotomy, right? Because again, biology does play a role in things, right? So to even talk, for example, about sexual desire involves in a lot of ways talking about the body, right? And how desire is felt through the body. So certainly biology plays a role, right? And certainly social relations play a role, right? So a lot of people kind of reproduce this sort of notion that it's got to be a little bit of both, or it's got to be one or the other, right? But as we're talking about whether or not you adhere to one or the other position, right? Both of those positions can be riddled with another number of fundamental misassumptions. Now, I'm assuming not everybody got this? All right, so we'll send it back just kind of through this middle section. All right. Now, biological determinism, the belief that biology creates our social identities, typically begins by using biological indicators, right? Well, if you're going to insist biology causes something, you probably want to be able to provide some sort of proof as to how it does, right? What about our biology causes? What about our social identities? So a lot of the things that we see mentioned a lot are these: chromosomes, hormones, genitalia. Perhaps if we're talking about race, skin tone, maybe about race and ethnicity, facial structure, right? Perhaps about sex or gender, facial structure, right? Hair type. These are a list of just a few biological indicators, right? Biological traits that people use to explain social identities, right? So for example, in terms of racial construction, certainly skin tone plays a role in how people describe social identities, right? Now, chromosomes, hormones, and genitalia tend to be three really big ones that are talked about when talking about sex, and then through, by extension, talking about gender, right? So you take these biological indicators and use them to define social identities, right? Normally, by trying to, through some sort of scientific experiment, demonstrate a correlation between one thing and something else, right? So for example, a correlation between skin tone and behavior, a correlation between hormone levels and behavior, a correlation between chromosomes and behavior, right? These is what will be measured, right, through psychological experiments, through biological experiments, right, through all sorts of means to try and demonstrate that there is a correlation, right? Without getting ahead of myself, suffice it to say, as the old adage goes, correlation does not mean what? Causation, right? Correlation does not mean causation, right? So certainly, a lot of people wouldn't debate the correlation, right? However, a lot of people in most established academic fields would debate the notion of cause. Now, biological determinists say that this correlation is causation, right? That these biological traits, biological differences are causing social differences, determining gender, determining how gender appears, what it looks like, right? So one example would be about racial construction. Now, we did a little activity last week in class where I asked you all to describe to me, right, how you would describe a black person to somebody who had never existed in society, somebody who just showed up, they're like, I somehow speak fluent English, right? I want to learn about this world I've never lived in, right? How would you describe this to me, right? So think like Fifth Element. Lilu shows up, right? She doesn't know anything. You put her in front of the TV, she learns as fast as she can, right? It's okay if you don't get all my references, but you should probably watch more movies from the 90s. Anyway, so I try sometimes. Yeah, this is how I get my day going, by trying to see what I can slip past your radars and get away with, right? But The Fifth Element is a really great movie. You should definitely watch it. It's a great sci-fi film, right? So now, in that little exercise, people started by talking about skin tone, by talking about hair type, right? And as we quickly demonstrated, no one of these biological traits in any way actually determines that you are a certain social identity, right? As we've talked about, social construction is about the stringing together of different meanings, multiple meanings, and attaching them to particular bodies, right? So no one thing, not skin tone, not hair, no one biological trait in and of itself determines a social role, right? Necessarily even determines that you'll be read as that particular social role, right? Now that biology-based approach contrasts with the identity-based approach, right? Rather than identity being something that's determined by your biology, identity is determined as something that you feel in relationship to others, right? Part of your expressed subjectivity, as we've come to learn to talk about it so far in this class, right? Now, what's tough is that if we assume that some sort of biological trait determines social behavior, right, then how do we explain difference, right? So if we assume that some combination of hormones, chromosomes, and genitalia make it so that men are physically stronger than women, right? Well, then how do you explain women that are physically stronger than men? How, in the biology-based approach, if you're assuming that traits determine social behaviors, right, how then can you account for the persistent differences within groups, right? So in other words, for the persistent differences between women, right? Not to mention the very persistent similarities between different groups, right? So, you know, if you, like, you know, on a genetic level, we share, what, like 99.9% of our genetic material, something like that, with like a banana, you know, right? Yeah, scary stuff, right? But that's actually funny because when they put the condom on the banana in sex ed class, it's like, well, actually on like some biological level, that's 99.9% accurate to do that, right? But if the biology-based approach, right, assumes that there is some sort of fundamental biological trait that's shared by, let's say, all of this particular group of people, by all women, by all Latino men, right? If you assume that in that biology-based approach, then how do you explain those differences within that group, and how do you explain the similarities between groups, right? And the reality is that the groups defined by biology are in never way perfectly reflected in cohesive and distinct biological categories. So even if we assume, right, even if we go back to this list here and assume for a second, right, that there are distinct there's a chromosomal binary, that there is a hormonal binary, that there is a genitalia binary, right? Even if we now turn to science itself, right, to the hard sciences and look at what they have to say, right, we find that they, for the most part, disagree with us, right, or disagree with this notion of a biological binary. Now, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because a good bit of this material we were actually able to visit in previous weeks in lecture, in particular my discussion of eugenics last week. But I'm going to talk really quickly about this notion of biological essentialism, right? So biological essentialism refers to this idea. It's very similar to biological determinism. This idea that our essence, our very core as individuals, comes from our biology, right? That who you are, right, the very, very essence of who you are, right, your natural self comes from biology. This might include aspects of our gender, our sex, our race, other identities, right? But biological essentialism typically assumes that there is this sort of like essence to you, this thing that's within you that really makes you who you are, and that thing is biological, right? And biological essentialism isn't just a mindset, right? It's not just a mindset, but it's also a way of talking about language, talking about things that people say, right? So, for example, does anybody know where the word hysterical comes from? Yeah?
I think it used to refer to when women were sexually deprived.
Okay, yeah. You're totally on the right track. This has to do with the medical kind of history of it, yeah.
And so when they went to the doctors would solve that or would stimulate them, and
Yeah, they'd use vibrators to bring them to orgasm, yeah.
they thought they had hysteria.
right? Hysteria. So this term hysteria, right, or being hysterical, was a psychological medical term, right, that was very specifically for women, right? And now it was used sometimes to describe a range of different conditions, which could include women not having sex, right, or being sexually deprived. It could include things that related to women's periods, right, that were symptoms of their periods. It could include things that were symptoms of menopause, right? But it was this sort of umbrella term that was used in this sort of hybrid space between psychology and the medical world to describe women who were variously depressed, angry, right? In other words, women who were acting in ways that probably weren't in line with the dictates of traditional femininity. Now, the word hysteria, hysterical, comes from a very specific root. Does anybody know what that root is? Does anybody think of any other word that they can come up with that has that kind of beginning in it? Hyster?
Oh, it has to do with the uterus, right?
Right, the uterus, right? A hysterectomy, right, is getting your uterus removed, right? It comes from the same Latin root. The biological belief was that literally a woman's uterus, right, that something about a woman's biology caused her to be depressed, right? And that the solution, right, for that probably had something to do with her needing to be more of a traditional housewife, perhaps to have more sex with her husband, right? Perhaps to just be reminded that she has things so good and that there's nothing to be depressed about, right? Now, so when you hear people say, right, this very, very offensive phrase that you hear a lot of people say, right, like that assumes that a woman's period determines her behavior, right? This is like a very, very core example of biological essentialism, right? Like, oh, she must be on her period. Oh, are you on your period? Right? These sorts of questions are fundamentally biological essentialist, right? It's like, I mean, perhaps, sir, you're just being a dick, right? First off, option A, maybe you should consider that. And that on any given Tuesday, this reaction would be merited, right? But also, it kind of relies on this very, very fundamentally flawed idea that our biology causes our social roles, right? Now, this is not to say that periods are not a real thing that cause real pain, that can cause any reasonable person to not be in a great mood that day, right? But by choosing to interpret those behaviors, right, as, oh, she must be on her period, oh, are you on your period, that particular interpretation, right, as opposed to any one number of million other interpretations, right, that you could possibly use to explain a particular set of behavior, that relies on this kind of biologically essentialist notion, right? And this happens all the time, right? When you hear this expression, oh, boys will be boys, right? We got to let our boys be boys. Boys will just be boys. You know what I mean? This is like a biologically essentialist thing, right? That explains and even justifies behaviors by saying, like, that's just who we are at our very core, at our very essence. That's just who we are, right? Now, this historical reference I've talked about before, so I'm not going to go back through it, right? But we talked, remember, about how there were all these forms of really, really flawed science, right? That used correlation, false correlation, to argue for causation, right? So, for example, we talked about how there was this argument used that since Native Americans, right, that indigenous populations were lactose intolerant in comparison to European settler populations, right, that their bodies must be weaker, right? So now the correlation, right, that Native Americans were typically less lactose tolerant was a true correlation. I'm not arguing with that. In fact, I explained it before, right? This had to do with the state of domesticated cattle and whether or not you actually force your kids to start drinking milk at a very young age. An odd thing, no doubt, because humans are the only ones that do that. Sorry, I'm kidding. I'm going off on a soapbox here, right? But then they use that as a causation thing, right? That this, the cause of this, right, is a weaker body, right? The correlation, right, with lactose intolerance and their identity, right, had nothing to do with causation. It wasn't being a Native American causes lactose intolerance. There wasn't this biologically essential sort of trait that all Native American, all indigenous people shared that made them lactose intolerant. No, they didn't domesticate cattle, you know, in the wide range and force their children to drink milk, developing lactose tolerance, right? So these are all examples of kind of biological essentialism or biological determinism, right? When you hear people talk about women's brain size as a way of trying to explain women's intelligence being less than men's. First off, women's intelligence is obviously not less than men's. And one cannot help but beg the question, if we live in a world where up until very, very recently women were excluded from like academia, excluded from higher education, excluded from all these positions of learning, then if like you sat women down and were like, here's a test, right? You can't go back and be like, it's women's brain size. Maybe it's like a patriarchal education system that's contributing to these differences, right? So all these are examples of this sort of biological determinism. And I think with all of these, it's really easy to accept and understand that these things are problematic, right? And that we understand that this idea that even if women's brain size, like on some sort of level, is on average smaller than men's brain size on average, probably having to do with, I don't know, cranial capacity, bigger heads, you know, right? That has nothing to do with actual intelligence, right? Or especially this appearance or social trait of intelligence, right? Because intelligence is not a real thing, right? It's a socially constructed idea. The idea of being smart or dumb, right? And IQ tests and things like this, you know, are meant to capture that in some sort of way, right? So now, thinking in terms of gender, this biological sort of essentialism, biological determinism, means that most people assume there is a dimorphic ideal. Now, dimorphic is the same thing as binary, right, or dichotomous, but specifically morph refers, you know, in rooted form to taking the form of, right, when you morph into something. So dimorphic then refers to this notion that at one point during gestation, you split, right, in the, you know, in early embryo development and are kind of morph into either male or female at this particular stage, right, what's normally referred to as sexual differentiation in the biological world. So most people assume there's this dimorphic ideal, male and female, and that dimorphic ideal is reflected in biology, right? So as I'm going to talk about, this kind of allows people to be about, like, hands off. Like, I don't have bad opinions, right? I'm not like problematic in my beliefs. It's just biology. It's just science, right? So I get to wipe my hands of any ethical commitment to something because it's just science, right? So a lot of people believe that there is this sort of biological dimorphic ideal. And the basis, right, the biological basis, the traits that they look for to talk about this, right, or the causes, the underlying biological causes, will be chromosomes, genitalia, and hormones, okay? These are the ones that you hear commonly. Now, most assume that the traits that are different between men and women have a biological basis. So, for example, if we're thinking about hormones, right, there's this notion that men and women have significantly different hormone levels, right, and significantly different hormone makeups. And then because of that, people use hormones to be able to interpret or explain particular behaviors in women, right? So, for example, people will be like, estrogen is what causes women's higher level of emotion. Right? Now, the social constructionist approach would say that if we're even assuming for a second that women demonstrate on average a different level of emotion and have a different way of expressing emotion than men do, right, that actually has nothing to do with estrogen levels, right, but actually has everything to do with the fact that from a young age, young girls were taught to emote in a particular way, and young boys were taught not to emote in that particular way, right? I think any guy who would likely admit, I would certainly likely admit, right, that at a certain point in your life you become aware of the ways in which you've learned to suppress, right, a number of different emotional traits, right? You've learned to suppress crying, right? You've learned to suppress certain forms of disappointment, the only acceptable one perhaps being disappointment in, like, competitive defeat, right? So all of that, right, is a social process of constructing your masculinity to be performed or done in a particular way, right? That happens despite the fact that our hormone levels are whatever they are, right? But when people say, oh, it's estrogen that's causing this particular level of emotion, right, they ignore the social constructionist approach. They basically just ignore your entire lifespan of development and everything you've been told to do by other people, right? And then turn to this biologically essentialist thing and say, oh, well, of course she's emotional, right? She's a woman. She has higher levels of estrogen. maybe she's on her period, right? You refer back to this sort of biologically essentialist approach, right? So what this then ends up doing, right, is sex, gender, and even sexuality, sexual identity, right, sexual role, maps onto and through this biological approach, right? People say there are two sets of chromosomes, there are two levels of hormones that are distinct, there's two sorts of genitalia that are distinct, and those collectively produce things such that we have a biological sex. That biological sex produces a social gender identity, and naturally, out of all of this, we become, because of the same biological, hormonal, chromosomal genitalia basis, naturally attracted to somebody of the opposite sex, right? So if you are born with, a penis and what, XY, is XY guys or guys are XX? XY, thanks science folks, right? If you're born with a penis and testes and XY chromosomes and a certain level of testosterone, that you are biologically male, and we'll talk about how problematic the notion of biological genitalia as male or female is, right? But people say this phrase, they say biologically male, right? And that therefore you will be masculine in your gender identity and performance, and you will be attracted to women, right? All because of this sort of thing, right? If we think about this in terms of sexuality, it's really easy to point out that the whole notion of coming out, the whole very act of coming out, indicates that everybody assumes everybody is straight until they come out, right? So this biological determinist approach is reflected in how we approach sexuality based off of the fact that straight people never have to come out, right? Because we assume that everybody is, because we believe so much in this notion that sexuality, sex, and gender are natural, biologically determined things, right? And that if somebody isn't, let's say, male and masculine and heterosexual, that maybe that's a variation, right? Maybe they'll come out because of that variation, but that we're not really debating this notion that there is this natural, normal, regular thing, right? But I'm here saying, no, actually, there isn't, right? Now, what's important about this is that the field of medicine carries significant power in society, right? And much of that's reflected through cultural practices. As mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, science and pop culture aren't separate. Science enters pop culture in all these different ways that make it so a lot of people act on science, right? As science evolves, as it enters the mainstream in increasingly quick ways because of, social media and digital communication technologies, people react to it, right? Medical breakthroughs are publicized in newspapers and magazines. Doctors are understood as cultural figureheads, and unquestioned experts. We see them on talk shows, on news shows, right? And medical science is used to justify social and political enterprises, right? This is really important, that if the medical industry can prove, for example, that back in the day, prove that homosexuality wasn't a psychological disorder, right? Increasingly now today, prove that gender dysphoria is not a psychological problem, right? If the medical field starts to be able to prove those things, oftentimes those trickle down then into social change, right? And this is because science and the medical field are given this illusion of being the source of pure truth, right? That they're objective, that people have no agenda, right? And that the experiments that they do are perfectly scientific and truthful, right? Now, the history of eugenics proves that science always has an agenda, just like every other academic field, right? And has become really important not only to a bunch of good things, but also to reinforcing a bunch of bad things, right? So if we look at the AIDS epidemic, for example, right? Cancer research, for example, medical science plays a large role in popular culture and is used to explore social concerns, right? So, for example, like black and gay sexuality in the case of AIDS, or perhaps pollution or cosmetics in the case of certain types of cancer. Now, for a little kind of quick historical lesson to help explain this even more, does anybody remember what AIDS was called before it was called AIDS? Yeah?
The gay man's disease, right?
Specifically, GRIDS. Gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome, right? Now, this is because people were coming in, right? This is in the late 70s, early 80s, and reporting a set of symptoms, right? Now, this was a set of symptoms, many of which were relatively common, a few of which were more unique. Now, doctors at the time were already beginning to ask about sexual practices, right? And many gay men who were going in to report those symptoms would out themselves as gay, right? Now, of course, other men, probably very comfortable with it, would out themselves as heterosexual. I don't know if that's outing necessarily right, in a world that assumes you are until you say otherwise. Now, straight men, this needs to be stressed, straight men with AIDS were coming in and reporting from day one, right? From day one, right? But doctors began to ignore them and assume, right, that the correlation of a few gay men coming in with the same set of symptoms must be a causation, right? The same sort of flawed thing, right, where science often captures correlation without a proper explanation of causation, right? So you saw this term GRIDS, gay-related immunodeficiency symptom, right? The medical establishment, by ignoring an entire set of evidence, right, by literally turning straight men away, assuming it's got to be something else, right, must be something different. Sure, they have the same symptoms, but it couldn't be the same thing, because this has to be because of sexuality, right? Then they create this notion that it is this false, entirely, patently, offensively false notion, right? And because of that, what did the public take up as the problem? Gay sex, right? And not the fact that the government, that medical institutions, right, that academic institutions weren't responding to a medical crisis in the way that they should have, right? So, then this allowed people to guilt any gay man who would have sex. And you can read countless testimonies of gay men at the time period of the AIDS crisis who felt like it was just completely unacceptable to have sex with other men because you were seen as being socially deviant, doing something that you knew could pass on something that was at the time seen as being caused by being gay and by having an active gay sex life, right? So, medicine is often wrong. Medicine and science are often wrong, are actively wrong, right? Are not a site of pure truth. But as a society, they are the site that we look to for the purest truth, right? Whereas other fields are seen as being gradually more and more subjective, right? However, when they're flawed, and they often are, this can lead to really, really problematic social issues. Yeah.
Can't gay men still not donate blood, like, to this day?
Yeah. Well, men who have had sex with men cannot donate blood until this day. Not just gay men, but any man who has had sex with men. And arguably, there are probably gay men, many of whom have not had sex with a man and could still donate blood, right? So I only say that to just complicate the picture as much as possible, right? But yeah, certainly, if you go to donate blood, you'll still see a bunch of offensive things, like if you've traveled to Africa in the past 3 months, if you traveled out of the country for a certain amount of time, if you've gotten tattoos recently. So I'm just disqualified across the board, but because I travel a lot and all the tattoos and everything else. So again, this is simply to say that medical science is not perfect or free from ethical or moral judgments. Still, HIV and AIDS activists constantly point to how freaking ridiculous it is that there's still this kind of very homophobic fear when it comes to blood donations, right? Because all donated blood is tested for not just HIV, but 1,000,001 other things as well, right? So, and not to mention that HIV and AIDS is had by straight and gay and everybody else alike, right? So it's a very, very silly, outdated, and kind of blatantly homophobic policy for blood donation, right? So now, the mistreatment, right, to bring this all together, the mistreatment of trans individuals is often justified by people using biological arguments about sex and gender being two and only two and unchangeable. Now, in 2015, then President Barack Obama expanded protections to trans students in public schools, right, through a myriad of measures. We're going to watch a video. We're only going to watch a couple minutes of it to keep this rolling. That reflects on that. It's a Fox News segment between Tucker Carlson and a guest on the segment, and they're talking about specifically critiquing this expansion of protections to trans students in public schools that Obama did. Now, when you watch this film, I want you to think of these 3 questions. So first, I want you to ask, how did you see biology brought up? Okay? In what ways was biology brought up? How was it used, right? So that third question, in what ways is biology connected with some notion of truth, right? How does Tucker Carlson and his guests, how do they use biology or science, right, as being this sort of thing that can't be touched, right? And in what way did they deploy it, for what end? And then I also want you to pay attention to this question of who is portrayed as the victims in this film, right? So who is kind of constructed as suffering from this new policy that Obama enacted. So I want you to think about those things and ignore the political pandering of this guy before the clip starts.
A Virginia school board voted to allow trans students to go to the bathroom of their choice, and the federal government is now applying pressure to get these non-discrimination laws in place at a local level. So Fox News, of course, threw a tantrum over it.
This apparently is being compelled upon us by the Office of Civil Rights through the U.S. Department of Education under the Office, the U.S. Department of Justice. And they're saying that Title IX, which was passed in 1972, somehow includes gender identity. And the notion that the federal government can reach into the 14,000 school districts across the United States of America and tell 90,000 school board members that you must comply or we're going to take away your federal education money is preposterous. That money is meant for the neediest children in our communities, for the hungriest children, for children with disabilities. And so is my federal government telling me that if I don't comply with whatever, this language or any other language, that I have to comply with their language or they're going to take away our children's lunch money?
Isn't it a little weird that a school, which is supposed to be rooted in science and the scientific method, is teaching now that there is no difference between men and women, that you can change your sex, but of course that's contrary to basic biology.
Well, certainly that's what you heard in the meeting, and it was funny because I just only heard the audio, and you would think from the applause that they were cheering by the fact that that motion passed, but they were cheering the single vote that tried to echo a parent's voice, and that was what was missing here, is, these are public schools for the public's benefit with public dollars, and we seem to say to parents, we want your tax dollars to run our schools, we want you to join PTAs, we want you to be involved and volunteer, we want you to fundraise, and then we want you to go away, because anything having to do with policy or rigor of curriculum or something like this that has very much to do with personal privacy and dignity of all students and all parents is not something we want your comments on.
The left's war on biology continues. It's a weird moment in America. It's really nice to talk to you this morning.
All right. So, so how do we see biology brought up in this film, or science? How's it brought up? Yeah.
As like an inherent truth that they're attacking.
Okay. Yeah. And in this case, what's the content of that truth? What is that scientific truth that they're attacking?
Gender binary.
Okay, but it's not stated, right? Right? Did anybody ever hear Tucker Carlson say they're attacking science and then say specifically, right, that they're attacking biologically determined sex and gender, right? But he conjures up this idea of science, right? And as an audience too, you would expect most people oh shit, they're coming after science now, man, this is problematic because science is probably always right? So now, who's portrayed as the victims by different people in this film? Yeah?
Well, there's the kids who will not have their lunch money, and then there's also the parents who are the victims.
Yeah. That was a bit later. That was smart to pick up on that, right? That also the parents are portrayed as the victims at the end, right? Specifically, she's saying, they want you to come to PTA, they want you to do this, do that, but then they don't want you to have a say in these things, right? Okay. Other folks? So, yeah.
School boards.
The school boards as well, right? 14,000 school boards, victim of this policy that's, strong-arming them and telling them you have to do this, right? And the kids, so who are the kids that are the victims here? Which kids, as far as you saw?
Like the ones who couldn't afford things and stuff.
Right, so what's happening is the government said that if the school districts, individual school districts, don't fall in line with this new policy protecting trans students, right, that they will lose federal funding, right? And so the students then become the victims of that potential loss, right? So low-income students, and then she also said what? Yeah?
Disabled students.
Students with disabilities, right? So from this, right, as far as her perspective of speaking, what are protected and what are unprotected identity categories? So in other words, what are identity categories that she views as being legitimately having legitimate grievances that are in need of legitimate kind of responses, and which group of students aren't? Right, extracted out of what we just read here, what we just talked about. Yeah.
Economic class and disability are
Right.
protected.
Right. So she is not disputing that economic class and disability are protected classes. Right. Right. In other words, rights-bearing classes. Right. Classes that the government might program specifically towards. Right. Now, but what gets left out? What is she saying isn't? Or she's implying should not be. Right, would be trans students, would be gender identity, specifically for trans students. And why is it okay then for her to ignore that group of students while supporting these other two protected classes? Yeah?
Biological determinism.
Right, because biology is truth with a capital T, right? Biology has no political agenda, right? It's just truth, it's just science, right? So I don't dislike trans students. I just love biology and I love science so much, right? See how like this starts to be really, really problematic, right? And that's how this ends up getting taken up, right? In a very real world way that involves kind of cultural aspects, political aspects, but specifically is people taking biology, right, which itself, right, actually in no way says any of this dimorphic stuff, right, and selectively using it to pursue a particular agenda, and in particular, right, to be more specific, being able to say this isn't an ethical decision, right? I'm not ethically saying I dislike this group of people. I'm just saying I agree with science, right? And you really get to wash your hands of any culpability for doing, for targeting individual groups of people because you say it's just biology, right? So this is that set of assumptions that we just kind of pointed out, right, of this sort of dimorphic ideal reflected in these three biological traits that lead to biological sex and then through that gender and sexual identity. However, we can really take apart each of these items on its own terms. And by that what I mean is that the actual biological sciences don't believe any of this stuff that a lot of people in popular culture have duped us into believing science does believe, right? Scientists do not believe in a dimorphic approach to biological sex. Scientists do not believe that there is such a thing as a hormone binary, a chromosomal binary, a genitalia binary, right? Science does not believe this, right? If you ever see something that's like the American Family Science Association publishes a paper that says that, sex is biologically determined, that's like that 1% of doctors that are not actually taken seriously in their field, right? The vast majority of doctors, of scientists, right? This is just undisputed truth. And I know that sounds problematic because I was just like, science isn't always right? But I'd like to think that we're doing a little bit better than they were before, right? So in the case of hormones, right, there's no clear line in terms of hormone levels between people who are assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth, right? I mean, there are these like sorts of general trends, but it's not like there's this line. It's not like if you have this hormone level, then guaranteed you're going to be male, or this hormone level, guaranteed you're going to be female. The overlap is massive, right? And even throughout the lifespan, the overlap can be massive, depending on what things you've been, subject to in terms of your environment, what you've been eating, right? All sorts of different things that make it so that there is, especially on the level of hormones, right, to begin with, really, really no clear line. It's a very unstable trait to use to really say much, right? And so then next we go to chromosomes, right? And now I can already tell by the fast responses from folks in here that there's some folks who perhaps are in scientific fields, right? We already know in the sciences that XX and XY are just two of many, many chromosomal combinations that occur naturally in the human genome, right? So while yes, a very, very large percentage of people do typically have either XX or XY, there's plenty of other combinations, right, that do exist naturally in the human genome, right? Now, a lot of people like to say, oh, well, those are just these, outlying things, right? And we can exclude them. But fundamentally, we can't, right? That's not how social sciences or biological sciences necessarily operate, right? We want to be able to understand and have our social knowledge reflect accurately the diversity of the biological world. it serves a particular purpose to ignore all of those outliers. It allows people to be able to justify this idea that there is a biological dimorphic ideal, this biological binary. But there's not, right? And even if we get down here to genitalia, it still remains the same. There is no such thing as a perfectly dimorphic like appearance of genitalia, right? Genitalia appears on a spectrum in general at birth, right? In terms of what appears, how big what appears is, right? There's no sort of kind of, black and white, A or B, clear dividing line, right? And we're going to talk a little bit talking a little bit about one instance, talking about intersex individuals and how that's one category that we can use to think through that specifically, right? So what scientific work really further clarifies for us in terms of the role of biology with social traits is first off that very little is really solely determined by biology, right? I mean, yes, in a sense, right? Like how our hair appears, our eye color, our skin tone, these things are definitely determined by biology, right? I mean, though we can do things to alter those as well, right? But the meanings that we give to those things as a society, right? And the things that we expect of people because they appear a certain way, because their biology appears a certain way, does not have to do with that, right? However, biology does have a strong influence, right? Influence, not determining, influence. Biology does have a strong influence, but biological determinism ignores human choice, it ignores human socialization, right? And in other words, what it does is it ignores how human choice is determined by socialization, right? So if you push me, rude by the way, but if you push me, right, and I respond by like hitting you back, right, then there's going to be somebody who's like, oh yeah, look at that, right, like he's being a guy, his testosterone peaked, he acted in rage to defend himself like his caveman ancestors would do in a similar situation, right? And boys will just be boys, right? What they're ignoring is that over the course of my lifetime, I've been told over and over again by my dad, by my uncles, by James Bond, by television, right? By all these things that as a guy, right, if somebody punches me, again, rude, right, I have to respond, right? I have to man up and fight back, right? Is this something in my biology that's forcing me to do it, right? I mean, certainly my body's probably feeling a lot of stuff, right? But my interpretation of that as meaning I need to fight, right? And my decision to fight in that instance is something that comes out of my own socialization as a man in a society that teaches men that they're supposed to be violent, right? Especially if their masculinity is challenged. So we might conclude then that biological determinism only appears to be true, right? It only appears to be true because it's used to justify the continued socialization of people into the roles that it claims to determine, right? It's circular. It's like, hey, listen, biology determines that men are going to be men in this way. So let's not tell men not to be men in that way, and then they will be men that way. And look, we can be like, we were right because biology totally determined this, right? What we don't realize is biological determinism, especially when it's used to justify doing nothing, right, creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's always going to appear true because we keep on falling for this notion that we have no choice but for it to be true. This notion that it's caused by biology rather than really influenced by socialization, right? So, we'll pick this up. It's a short clip, but we'll pick it up at the beginning of Thursday just so I have a chance to talk about the readings. So we have two readings for this week. They're both from the book, okay? So the first reading is called The Five Sexes Revisited. Sorry, I forgot the V in there. Hold on 1 second before packing up. We have plenty of time. So Anne Fausto Sterling is the author, and here she's writing this as a follow-up to an older piece of hers. So she wrote a piece called The Five Sexes, and now she's writing a new piece based off of more recent information about intersex births, and she's revisiting this old piece. So in the first piece, she had suggested an approach to biological sex that had 5 options instead of 2. Okay, this is also as well. This is on D2L, right? This is at the end of the slide, so you can go and pull this up. In the piece, she's demonstrating how biological science shows that the complexity of sex is too much to categorize in any way, right? That there's not even a biological dimorphic ideal. And she covers a lot of the arguments about biological determinism in it. She addresses a lot of the things that pertain to chromosomes, to genitalia, to hormones. So first question is, how has the author's thinking changed since the first piece? How does the author feel about biological determinism? I mean, obviously, she's not a fan, but like, why? And what do you think about the author's suggestions at the end, right, for this particular system? The next piece we have is doing gender, determining gender, transgender people, gender panics, and the maintenance of the sex, gender, sexuality system. If you cite this in a paper, feel free to include everything before the colon, because that's a long title. So the two authors, Westbrook and Schilt, discuss what they term gender determination, where your gender is authenticated in various instances. We can think about this similar to like doing identity, right, where you display things, but that they're read and interpreted, right? So that's kind of similar to gender determination. Now, contrast the biology-based approach and identity-based approaches to gender determination that we mentioned today. And they track three instances of gender determination. First, federal and state proposals prohibiting gender-based discrimination. Next, a proposal to remove the general sex change surgery requirement to change your sex in New York City on driver's license. And then finally, controversies over trans people participating in sports. So these are three different instances, arenas, contexts in which the authors discuss how gender determination works. The questions you want to answer are, do the authors prefer biological or identity-based approaches, right? And why? What are the limits of either approach as far as they discuss? And who gets mistreated by biological determinism and how? Look at that, we're out of here 4 minutes early. I'll stay for those minutes if anybody has any quick questions. Otherwise, I have office hours after this.